When Russia launched its Ukraine invasion in February 2022, the Kremlin assumed that there would be no price to pay for its aggressive actions. The tanks would roll in, the fighter jets would fly, and Russia would topple Ukraine in a glorious special military operation that gave Vladimir Putin everything he ever wanted. But none of that happened. Instead, Putin has been forced to pay a heavy price in the blood of his country's soldiers for paltry gains in Ukraine. And in December, Ukraine revealed just how shocking Russia's troop losses are each month. Putin's army is bleeding out, and it's Ukraine that wields the knife. On December 16th, UNM reported that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy had visited the Netherlands, where he made a speech to the country's parliament. Naturally, the Ukraine war encompassed a large part of that speech, leading to a revelation that Russia's military is losing soldiers at an astonishing rate. Putin does not believe in people. He believes only in power and money. He spends about 30,000 soldiers' lives at the front every month. Not wounded, 30,000 killed every month, Zelenskyy told the Parliament of the Netherlands. There was a month when 25,000 Russians were killed, another month 31,000. We have drone videos confirming these deaths. If these numbers are accurate, then Russia is losing enough soldiers to be down by around 360,000 annually. These aren't wounded troops that can recover and head back into Ukraine, as Zelenskyy says. About 30,000 of Russia's soldiers die each month, which is a rate of manpower attrition that not even a regime as brutal as Putin's can sustain forever. Zelenskyy mentioned confirmation and 25,000 Russian deaths in October. Both were reported on by United 24 media on November 7th. That month saw Zelenskyy make the same claim about Russia's October death rate, in addition to noting that Russia likely lost about 2,000 to 3,000 more soldiers whose deaths weren't captured on camera. The outlet said that this death toll amounted to the highest monthly loss of soldiers that Russia had experienced since Putin launched his invasion. And if Zelenskyy is accurate when he says that other months have seen Russia lose 31,000, that record has already been broken. There has only been 1 month since October for which Ukraine could have figures, meaning Zelenskyy may have just revealed that Russia lost 31,000 soldiers in November. That number isn't official yet, but if the conclusion is true, it tells us two things. Russia's attritional strategy is failing it harder than it ever was before, and Ukraine's new incentives for causing Russian casualties are working. We'll come back to Russia's attritional method of war and what it tells us about Putin and his leadership in a moment. However, the incentive program that has led to so many of Russia's deaths being confirmed is an interesting evolution in Ukraine's tactics that deserves more attention. On November 7th, which is the same date that Zelenskyy confirmed the 25,000 Russian dead, multiple outlets published a report in which it revealed that Ukraine has partially gamified its drone warfare strategy. For context, gamification involves the incorporation of concepts typically used in video games into processes that aren't traditionally game-related. Think online leaderboards and earning points to trade for prizes, and you get the idea. The latter seems to be what Ukraine has implemented into its drone warfare, as CBC reveals that the country has created something called the Brave One market that it uses to reward soldiers who score kills with their drones. Ukrainian soldiers who sign up to this marketplace receive points for their confirmed drone kills, with CBC saying that 12 points are rewarded for taking out a soldier and around 40 are given to a drone operative who destroys a tank. These points can then be spent in the Brave One market, which offers Ukraine's soldiers access to other defense technology that they can use to score even more points. Though this may seem like a strange concept, 400 of Ukraine's drone units now compete for points across the entire program. Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, has also commented on the system, telling the New York Times, "This helps us stop the enemy. If this gives additional motivation to our military, we are happy to support it." Question marks could be raised about the morality of a system that reduces the lives of soldiers to mere points, but there is no questioning the impact. Ukraine is now killing around 30,000 Russian soldiers monthly, per Zelenskyy, and that is massive when it comes to the country's ongoing defense of the territory that Russia has invaded. However, as Ukraine comes up with ever more ingenious ways to bleed Russia's military dry, the main reason why death is occurring among Putin's forces at such a massive scale is much simpler. Putin does not care about the lives of his soldiers. Zelenskyy implied that in the comments that we shared earlier in the video, but he outright stated it later on in his speech to the Parliament of the Netherlands. Russian assaults are always insanely bloody, but Putin doesn't care. Russians don't count their dead, but they count every dollar, every euro they lose, Zelenskyy declared. In other words, Putin doesn't view the thousands of dead Russians whose blood is on his hands as human beings. They are resources to be spent, just like any other piece of military equipment. And Zelenskyy is far from the only person who believes that. Over a year before Zelenskyy's Russian death toll revelation, the Belsat news outlet labeled the Ukraine war a war of expendable people. while asking the question of why so many Russians seem so willing to die in Ukraine for Putin's cause. Part of the reason, the outlet argues, is that many of those who are signing contracts to enter Ukraine come from the many impoverished areas of Russia that don't benefit from the type of care and investment received by major cities such as Moscow or St. Petersburg. Ethnic minorities were signed up in droves with the promise of massive salaries, yet it was often this second class of human resources, as Belsat dubs them, that were sent to the front to die. Not a lot has changed since, and this is all by design. Russia's method of war has usually been attritional, as the country's military doctrine relies upon Russia being capable of outlasting the other guy. But in Ukraine, we've seen that doctrine paired with Putin's complete disregard for human life. Zelenskyy points that out, as does a man named Alexander Borodai. He's no ordinary Russian. A State Duma deputy, at least in November 2024, Borodai was once the man that Putin entrusted to be his puppet leader of the Russian-favoring Donetsk People's Republic, and he has some interesting things to say about Putin's views of the people he's sending into Ukraine. Soldiers are bought like meat. From the point of view of the people in suits, these people do not represent much social value. Why is that? They tend to be older, right? They are unproductive members of society, Borodai explained, before noting that many of those that Russia sends into Ukraine fit the profile of what Soviet-era writer Maxim Gorky deemed expendable people. Borodai continued, adding, "To put it bluntly, it's mainly the people who volunteer here who are expendable. That's their main characteristic. If they're dispensable people, they can be used in the war to exhaust the enemy as much as possible." Borodai didn't intend for these comments to be made public. They were revealed thanks to a recording shared all over the Russian internet, Belsat says. However, these comments perfectly encapsulate how Putin views Russia's soldiers, and they help to explain why the country's death toll is now so high in Ukraine. To Russia's leader, a dead Russian soldier isn't a husband, father, brother, or even a human being. That dead soldier means one less Ukrainian drone or bullet that can be used to stop Russia's unrelenting assaults. Such brutalism isn't a bug in the Russian military structure, it's a feature. And it's one that is encouraged through sheer indifference at best that Russia shows to those who sign up to fight Putin's war. In a November article, DW questioned why the brutal culture that pervades Russia's military is allowed to go unchecked. This brutality isn't just meted out to Ukraine's soldiers and civilians. The very people who sign up to fight for Russia are often those who end up mistreated, tortured, or murdered. The outlet explains that Russia's ground-level officers can choose where their soldiers are deployed, which creates the possibility of officers who have axes to grind sending their soldiers into kill zones as part of suicidal runs from which nobody is even intended to return. Soldiers can be shot by their own people, only to be declared killed or missing in action. But all of this stems from the very top, as a psychoanalyst named Alina Putilovskaya explains to DW. The superiors who commit these cruel acts of violence have superiors of their own who mock them, for example by giving them unrealistic orders and withholding vital supplies from their units, Putilovskaya explains. These high-ranking officials project an image of superiority, invincibility, and prosperity to the outside world. It's a ridiculous sort of irony. Russia wants its officials to seem invincible as those officers order the deaths of their subordinates on a scale that has reached an unprecedented level in the war. If the logic here seems crazy, you'll be right. At least it's crazy to anybody outside of the Kremlin, as even basic logic tells us that an invading force should be trying to keep as many of its soldiers alive as possible. Even if Putin doesn't care about his soldiers, fewer deaths equals stronger attacks against Ukraine by virtue of the Russian military not bleeding veterans out at an astonishing rate. But Putin doesn't see it that way. To him, every scrap of progress that Russia makes in Ukraine is proof that the approach he favors is working. This only makes sense if you view Russia's soldiers as Putin views them, resources to be expended rather than human beings with skills that can be utilized. Plus, as the conversation points out, Putin is so willing to stick to an approach that has such a massive body count because the attritional strategy has worked well for Russia in the past. Russia's modern spin on its age-old approach combined attrition with mass mobilization, with the latter being the ability to move massive numbers of soldiers to a single location with the intention of breaking down the defenses in that location. Russia's current push for the Donetsk-based city of Pokrovsk is a perfect example, as Russia had amassed 170,000 soldiers to attack this single location by November. This combination leads to the creation of the meat grinder, as the conversation notes, as it says, "Past victories do not guarantee future success, but for the Russian President Vladimir Putin and his military planners, it seems the dead and disabled bodies of their own soldiers are necessary collateral damage." However necessary those deaths may be in Putin's eyes, there's no denying that Russia's leader is receiving very little in return for the massive price he is asking Russia's people to pay. For instance, Russia Matters says that the 4 weeks between November 11th and December 9th saw Russia gain just 243 square miles. This is roughly a 1-month period, meaning we can equate Zelensky's figures to it. Assuming 30,000 Russian soldiers died to make these gains, that amounts to 123 troops dead per square mile. That's a ridiculous figure. But even worse is that 243 square miles is an improvement over the 165 square miles that Russia captured for a similar loss of soldiers between October 14th and November 11th. This massive churn for minimal gains led the national interest to declare that Russia won't win the Ukraine war anytime soon in a December 15th article. Putin can claim that Russia is on the verge of a dominant victory all he wants, but the reality, as revealed in a December 14th report by the Institute for the Study of War, is that Russia can't sustain the level of assaults combined with attrition that Putin allows for much longer. Russian forces will likely continue to struggle to maintain the Kremlin's desired multi-pronged offensive operations in different operational directions due to the long-term material and manpower costs of such operations, the Institute says. Putin will see this as a problem only in terms of needing more resources to see his will carried out, rather than as a sign that his complete disregard for his soldiers is causing Russia massive battlefield problems. It's this blind devotion to tactics that kill his soldiers that could be Putin's downfall. But that can only happen if what comes next is enough to punish Putin for his short-sighted approach. Zelenskyy made that point in the Netherlands with a call for stronger economic measures to place even more pressure on Russia. Building on his comments about how Putin cares more about money than he does about his own soldiers, Zelenskyy said, "That's why a strong decision on Russian money is needed. These funds must work to defend against Russia. I urge you to support this." Ukraine's president is referring to the ongoing wrangling within Europe about what to do with the hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen Russian assets that various European Union countries hold. Right now, the EU is debating whether to use those assets, which amounts to more than $200 billion, as a loan guaranteed by EU members themselves. Ukraine could use this loan to support itself militarily and socially, and you can learn more about it if you check out our video on the subject. As you'll see if you do watch that video, the situation isn't as clear-cut as the EU deciding to seize the frozen Russian assets. An abundance of potential legal issues stand in the way, with the loan idea being a potential workaround. Still, the EU may be plowing ahead. On December 12th, the BBC reported that EU governments collectively agreed to indefinitely immobilize the frozen Russian assets, likely in preparation for providing them to Ukraine in the form of a loan. Russia isn't happy about that, and has threatened to seize European private investors' holdings inside Russia in response. That's according to The Guardian, which said in a December 15th report that Russia will use the seizure to claim $230 billion worth of damages from the Euroclear financial services provider, which is responsible for holding about $217 billion of the frozen Russian assets. This seizure appears to be in preparation for a court-based challenge of the EU's loan proposal, about which a decision will be made at the end of the week. Any court judgment would occur in Russia, and it's expected that the EU judges won't accept any ruling that Russia makes. However, The Guardian says that Russia may try to lean on other countries with which it has ties to get the EU's members to go along with the ruling. The wrangling continues then. But the fact that Putin and his Kremlin cronies are sweating so much over the issue of the frozen Russian assets proves the point that Zelenskyy made in the Netherlands. When it really comes down to it, Russia does care about money more than soldiers that it sends to their deaths in Ukraine. It certainly seems to be putting more effort into mounting a claim against the EU than it is in developing any sort of strategy to solve the problem of the Russian military's ever-rising death rate. Russia wants as much money as it can get its hands on. Anything that deprives Russia of money is good for Ukraine, as it looks to slowly bleed Russia economically while it's killing the country's soldiers in record numbers. Coming back to those dead soldiers, it's also becoming increasingly clear that Russia is struggling to replace those that it's losing. At least it's struggling to replace the dead with soldiers from inside Russia itself. In November, CNN reported that Russia has such a shortfall in domestic recruits that it started using tactics like bribery and deception to get foreign fighters to sign contracts to fight in Ukraine. We don't know how many foreign fighters are inside Ukraine right now, though Ukraine estimates the number at somewhere in the region of 18,000 from 128 countries. Ukraine has also captured nearly 200 soldiers from 37 other countries than Russia since Putin launched his invasion, so it's clear that foreign soldiers are in Ukraine. Accounts from those soldiers reveal the dirty tactics that Russia has resorted to in its recruitment of them as domestic recruitment falters. Asia News offers an interesting perspective on how Russia approaches domestic recruitment, revealing that it treats the practice almost like a business. In a December 16th article, it said, "This recruitment has increasingly taken on the characteristics of a business model. Informal intermediaries operate within ethnic communities, receiving payments for every person they recruit." This approach tracks pretty well with Putin's view of his soldiers as expendable resources, as the pay-for-hiring approach shows him essentially trading one resource, money, for another, people. That's basically how any job works, but most jobs don't involve people getting paid off to recruit cannon fodder for a brutal war. The outlet adds that many of Russia's recruiters are chasing the ruble so intently that they're more than happy to provide misleading or even false information to recruits about what they will be doing in Ukraine. Many of the 30,000 who are dying each month were lured in with promises that they would be safe working in support roles, only for reality to hit them like a literal bullet to the head when they were pushed onto the front lines. However, these deceptive practices may not hold up for much longer. As Radio Free Europe Radio Liberty reported in October, many of the regions from which Russia recruits the bulk of its soldiers are now slashing the size of signing bonuses. Samara is a perfect example, as recruiters who would have been paid a signing bonus of 3.6 million rubles or around $45,540 at the start of 2025 are now getting offered 400,000 rubles or about $5,000 for their signatures. Could that be a sign that Russia is running out of the money it needs to keep sending soldiers to Ukraine? If it is, then Zelensky's call for Europe to do more to hurt Russia financially makes even more sense. If the money that has tempted so many Russians into Ukraine dries up, the contract signatures will follow. And if the influx of fresh recruits becomes a problem for Russia, Ukraine only has to keep on doing what it's doing when it comes to killing record-breaking numbers of Putin's soldiers each month. Something will have to give. And it's looking increasingly likely that that something will be Russia's ability to sustain the meat grinder approach it's taken to the war. There are already signs that Russia has problems, and it's created a front line so massive in Ukraine that it can't sustain strong assaults, and its defenses are too weak to fend off counterattacks. The battlefield truth is catching up to Putin, and his entire narrative of Russia as the dominant power in Ukraine is crumbling around him faster than his own frontline forces. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the scale of Russia's losses in Ukraine. And thank you for watching.